Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Melissa Murray. I am the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law here at NYU, and I'm also the Faculty Director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. We are gathered tonight for a book discussion on Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley and the Struggle for Equality by Tomiko Brown-Nagin. And we are thrilled that Dean Brown-Nagin will be interviewed tonight by Sherrilyn Ifill, a member of the NYU Law class of 1987. As Women's History Month comes to a close, and on the heels of the confirmation hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, it feels like an especially fitting time to dedicate an evening to talking about the legacy of the late Judge Constance Baker Motley, who has for so long inspired so many, including Judge Jackson, with whom she shares a birthday. We are very grateful for our co-sponsors for tonight's panel, the Law Alumni of Color Association and the Women of Color Collective. Before I welcome our next speaker, I want to introduce tonight's panel, I want to set out a few logistics. First, captioning is available via the caption feature, so please feel free to utilize that feature. Also, we welcome your questions throughout the evening, so please submit your questions to the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we can. If you can, keep them to the Q&A box, it will be easier than using the chat function. We also strongly encourage all of you to buy and read this incredible book, and we'll have information on how you may purchase it as well. And now, as we move on to the program, I would like to introduce a very special guest. First of all, I will say that it is really a pleasure to think about and reflect on the legacy of Judge Motley, because again, she has been an inspiration to so many, including myself. When I was getting ready to apply to law school, I read Judge Motley's autobiography and was so inspired by her work that I logged onto the website for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And there I found a list of scholarships and other financial support for young students entering law school or college who are interested in a career of civil rights. And so I applied to one of them, and very happily I was awarded one, which made it possible for me to attend Yale Law School. I've always been grateful for LDF and its support of my legal education. And so last year, in the midst of all of the upheaval around the cries for racial justice across this country, I was especially gratified when LDF reached out to me to participate in the selection of an inaugural cohort of what they were calling the Marshall Motley Scholars. The Marshall Motley Scholarship Program was created for the purpose of seeding the next generation of civil rights lawyers to work on issues of civil rights in the South. I immediately said yes and had the great pleasure of interviewing so many fantastic young men and women who are getting their start in the legal profession and were so dedicated and committed to the work of civil rights and racial justice. And one of those young people, I am delighted to say, who's not only selected to be in that inaugural cohort of Marshall Motley Scholars, was also selected to become a member of the NYU class. And so this new NYU student and Marshall Motley Scholar, Kendall Long, is here tonight. And I am delighted that not only do we have him as a member of our 1L class, but he's also here tonight to help us introduce the many different people who are going to be on this panel tonight and help us with this book conversation. So I will turn it over to Kendall to introduce our moderator, Sherrilyn Ifill. Go ahead, Kendall.
Thank you, Professor Murray, for that generous introduction, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for being here tonight. As an inaugural NAACP Legal Defense Fund Marshall Motley Scholar, it is a great honor for me to introduce tonight's moderator, Sherrilyn Ifill, President and Director Counsel Emeritus of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. As the second woman to lead LDF, Director Emeritus Ifill provided visionary and transformational leadership during her 9 years as President and Director Counsel. Director Emeritus Ifill graduated from Vassar College in 1984 with a Bachelor of Arts in English and earned her JD from NYU Law in 1987. She joined LDF in 1988, leaving in 1993 to join the faculty at the University of Maryland, where she taught for over 20 years. Since returning to LDF in 1998, and indeed long before then, she has been an influential voice in this country's national dialogue and her continued efforts in fighting for civil rights. Please join me in welcoming Director Emeritus Sherrilyn Ifill. To introduce Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin, I'm honored to welcome NYU Law alumna Sarah Moss, Vice Chairman of the Estee Lauder Companies, and founding supporter of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. At Estee Lauder, Sarah co-leads the Women's Leadership Network and works collaboratively with senior leaders and others across the organization to drive the company's women leadership initiatives and governance pillars. After attending law school, Sarah clerked for Judge Motley, then U.S. District Judge in the Southern District of New York. And I know I speak for the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network and everyone this evening when I say how happy we are to have her here. Please welcome Sarah Moss.
Thank you, Kendall. It's a pleasure to be here. It was an honor to be a law clerk for Judge Motley after I graduated from NYU Law School. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here tonight to introduce Dean Tomiko Brown Nagin, author of Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley, and the Struggle for Equality. I will tell you as an aside, it's a terrific book. It really captures the career and life of Constance Baker Motley, her determination, her courage, and her groundbreaking achievements. I would like to say a few words about Dean Brown Nagin before we begin. She is the Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, the Daniel P.S. Paul Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School, and a member of the History Department at Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. She is also the author of a prior book, Courage of Dissent, Atlanta and the Long History of the Civil Rights Movement. Dean Brown Nagin has a BA in history, summa cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa from Furman University, a JD from Yale Law School, where she was on the editor of the Yale Law Journal, and a doctorate from Duke University. There are very few trios that are as fabulous as Constance Baker Motley, Cheryl Eiffel, and Tomiko Brown Nagin, but we have them here tonight. I'm so looking forward to their thoughts and their discussion. So please join me in welcoming Dean Tomiko Brown Nagin, who will begin tonight with a brief reading from the book. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I first want to say that I'm super excited with you this evening with some of my favorite people. Thank you to Melissa Murray for your welcoming remarks, and of course to you, Sarah, for your generous introduction. And thanks to the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network, the Law Alumni of Color Association, and the Women of Color Collective for hosting me tonight. And of course, I am grateful to Cheryl Eiffel for being in conversation with me. I'm going to begin our evening tonight with a reading from a chapter of my book on Motley's most famous case, which was the battle to desegregate the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, as they call it. This man has got to be crazy, Thurgood Marshall yelled to Motley in January of 1961. That's your case. Marshall had descended upon Motley's office waving a letter from James Meredith. The missive contained such a preposterous idea that Marshall thought the writer must be out of his mind. I am submitting an application for admission to the University of Mississippi, Meredith wrote, and I am anticipating encountering difficulty with the various agencies here in the state. In view of the brewing trouble, Meredith requested Marshall's legal assistance. After Marshall finished laughing about Meredith's proposal to sue Ole Miss, he washed his hands of the case. Marshall knew Motley had the smarts and the courtroom skills to do the job, and he thought her gender might be an advantage. The fight to desegregate Ole Miss might get someone killed, but in the context of Mississippi's white supremacist yet chivalrous culture, as Marshall saw it, a Black woman would fare better than a Black man. Any white supremacist, he opined, would scarcely think twice about murdering a Black man, but might hesitate to lynch a Black woman. The very idea of a Black woman lawyer violently clashed with the worldview of Dugas Shands Esquire, the white male lawyer who defended Ole Miss. Shands refused to address the Inc. Fund lawyer in the customary manner as Mrs. Motley. Instead, he used only indirect references, calling Motley her or she. At one point early on, Motley jumped to her feet in a bid to put an end to the charade. But the tipping point occurred when Shands called her Constance. Motley immediately objected. I would like for Mr. Shands not to call me by my first name, Motley insisted. Henceforth, The lawyer referred to Motley as the New York Counsel. After months of struggle and endless delays, Meredith had had enough. Browbeaten by white resistance, Meredith wrote to Motley, resigned. I will not attempt to obtain an undergraduate degree from the University of Mississippi, the letter proclaimed. Keenly aware that Motley, who had poured herself into the case, would be disappointed in his decision, Meredith pleaded for understanding. I am human after all, he wrote. Meredith had grown tired of waiting for a deliverance that never came. Life had passed him by. His peers had graduated from college, begun careers, and moved on with their lives. In the meantime, he and his family had endured a high cost, fighting to integrate the University of Mississippi. Motley was stunned by the message. In order to salvage her case and support her client, she morphed from lawyer to therapist, a role she often played in high-stakes civil rights cases. To get a handle on the fraught situation, the pair would talk in Motley's New York City apartment, where Meredith could taste freedom. There, Motley cajoled Meredith. She persuaded him that he had gone too far and that too much had been invested in the case by the Inc. Fund and the Federal Court of Appeals to abandon the litigation. Just as Meredith reached his breaking point, support arrived, precisely as Motley had promised. On September 10th, 1962, US Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black intervened, halting any further action preventing James Meredith's matriculation to Ole Miss. While in Mississippi, Motley built a community with a small band of lawyers and activists who took part in LDF's effort to end Jim Crow in the state. She leaned on Medgar Evers, the NAACP's most prominent operative in Mississippi, who often invited Motley to his home, where she enjoyed home-cooked meals and fellowship with Evers, his wife, and their children. But only 1 month after Motley left Mississippi for the last time, Medgar Evers was assassinated. It devastated her. Motley couldn't get out of her bed for weeks following his death. She couldn't even bring herself to attend his funeral. Nevertheless, she had left the state victorious. Constance Baker Motley emerged as one of the most respected lawyers in America. A story in the New York Times titled "Integration's Advocate" captured the professional heights to which Motley had soared. Quote, a tall, striking woman with piercing dark eyes is almost always in the courtroom in the eye of the hurricane surrounding the struggle for civil rights in the South. Motley's fight to desegregate Ole Miss had brought her public esteem and professional success, along with devastating loss and profound pain. Thank you. I'm happy to begin our conversation.
Wonderful. Well, good evening. Good evening. I'm Sherilyn Ifill, and I am absolutely thrilled to be in this conversation about this wonderful book, Civil Rights Queen, that I had the privilege of reading and that I had been awaiting for some time. And Dean Nagin, I want to first of all congratulate you on the publication of this book. It is richly resourced. It's quite evident the tremendous research that went into completing the book. And many of us have been waiting on it. And so it's very exciting to have it finally published. Just for the audience to know that, you know, when Dean Nagin was talking about Judge Motley's work on behalf of James Meredith, she was talking about the time in which Judge Motley was really one of the most extraordinary litigators at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the organization I've been privileged to lead for the last 10 years until 2 weeks ago. And so this is especially meaningful to me. I also want to salute Sarah Moss, who was part of a program we did on Judge Motley last year for her, what would have been her 100th birthday, and Kendall Long, our Marshall Motley Scholar, who's at my alma mater, NYU. We're so excited about this cohort of scholars that are walking in the footsteps and will walk in the footsteps of some of our finest civil rights litigators. But Dean Nagin, I want to come to this wonderful book, and I had a bunch of questions all prepared, which I still do, but I didn't know what passage you were going to read, and you read that passage, and so I want to probe that a little bit. I'm curious about why you chose to read that particular passage. And I guess I would say there's so many layers to it that I'd like to ask you about. So one of them is what you read at the very beginning. I mean, here is Judge Motley talking to the fearless, incredibly iconic leader of the Legal Defense Fund, Thurgood Marshall. And she comes to him with the Old Miss case. And at this point, she's already prevailed in several DSEG cases, if I'm not mistaken. She'd already done Clemson, perhaps, and maybe Georgia, or was this after that? But in any case, it's not as though Marshall fears this. He's done University of Texas Law School. He did University of Oklahoma Law School, did the desegregation litigation. You know, so he had his own illustrious history in this work, but he thinks this is crazy. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about, you know, essentially what Marshall says to her about the role of Motley as a woman, and the sense that there was a way in which she was uniquely provocative to Southern racists, as you described, you know, the judge who won't call her Ms. Motley, but tries to call her by her first name, and finally settles on New York counsel. So it's something particularly provocative about a Black woman lawyer litigating in the South. But at the same time, Marshall is suggesting that there's something about her being a woman that may allow for her to take certain liberties that a man, a Black male lawyer might not be able to take litigating a similar case in the South. So can you say just a little bit more about that? And I would love to know why you chose that passage as well to read.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sherilyn, for that question. And you started to peel back some of the layers, expose some of the layers involved with that passage. First of all, I chose it because it does go to the reality that Motley and certainly Marshall and all of the Inc. Fund lawyers litigated under threat of their own lives. And I think it's so important to remind people of that courage. And I do it because it has the virtue of being true, but also because, of course, in writing this book, I'm speaking to us. I'm speaking to people who are engaged today in this work. And as difficult as these times are, I think it's important to just call into memory, bear witness to the personal dedication, the mission that these lawyers were on. And yes, the danger. And I think that's it's especially important to point out in the context of this extraordinary woman lawyer. And you know, the passage about Marshall saying to her that, or thinking she might have an advantage, you know, I understand that point of how there's special dangers attached to Black manhood at this time. It's also true that I do want to foreground that there are also special dangers that attend to being a Black woman, including, and this actually is not mentioned in that particular passage, but of course, sexual violence is a very real and present danger. There are Black women who are killed in the struggle for equality. And I also wanted to use it as a window onto just the reality that as Motley is litigating for the movement, she also is litigating for her own dignity and for her own rights. Just the disrespect of not being called, you know, Mrs. Motley. And it can be difficult for, you know, to our modern sensibilities to appreciate just how much of an insult that was. It was an insult. And to just think about someone only calling you her or she. Mm-hmm. And there are other places in the book where I mention how the lawyer would point And so it's really an attempt to just break down this incredibly courageous, extraordinarily intelligent woman. And the final thing I'll say is, I use the title Civil Rights Queen. It comes from a journalistic account of Motley, which brings into relief just what she meant. So on the one hand, she is subject to all of these abuses, but on the other hand, she really transcends her lawyerly role. There are, African Americans and some white women they're just fascinated by her, right? So a few people had seen a Black lawyer or a woman lawyer, and she's just this extraordinary combination of a Black woman lawyer. And so I thought that there are ways in which that passage distilled many of those things for this audience.
While you were reading the passage, an image flashed on the screen of Judge Motley talking with James Meredith. They were kind of on a balcony. And, one of the things you noticed was one of the things that was always true about Judge Motley, which is that she was meticulously turned out in a very formal way. It was the silk shantung dresses, it was the Cuban heel shoes, it was the string of double pearls. The idea, of this may sound like it's a trivial thing, but it's actually not a trivial thing, that she knew that this attention would be on her. And she would have to present herself in a very particular way. She was meticulous about her appearance in any case, but people were watching. And so part of it was she had to be turned out. And she was turned out quite elegantly. And that photograph that was shown while you were speaking is a perfect example of that. One of the things I love about this book, Dean Nagin, is actually encapsulated in something you say right at the beginning about why you wrote it. And you said in the book, the invisibility of this fascinating woman in our public histories and popular culture distorts our sense of who it is that has rebuilt America. Motley's invisibility in our nation's history shortchanges us all, but her absence is especially detrimental to the sense of belonging of the many communities she visibly represented: African Americans, West Indians, women, girls, immigrants, and the working class. And of course, that powerfully resonates for me, because one of the reasons that Judge Motley always felt so heroic for me is that I too come from a family that is all of those things. And there is a way in which that's not been part of the story about the amazing civil rights leaders and litigators. Many are originally from the South, and Thurgood Marshall's family would have been seen at least as middle class and in the Black community and so forth. And I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on why you felt it was important to explicate who she was and all of that complexity, and add that to the story that really had been missing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Well, first of all, it was really important to me to center gender as mediated by race, by immigration background, by being a Northerner, so many different things. Because as I mentioned, I do think the explanation for Motley's absence from our histories, to the extent that her tremendous impact warrants, is a function of the reality that in Western societies, including in the civil rights historiography, leadership and being a male are seen as one and the same. And I do think it's important to appreciate that this was a woman from this working class immigrant background who couldn't even afford to attend college without help, was one of the figures who helped to change the legal architecture of this country. It matters to you, it matters to me, it matters to so many people. And I'm just ecstatic that it happens that this book has been published at the same time as Judge Jackson's nomination, because of course, for those of us who know her, she's just, I mean, she's the queen. She's so inspiring, but a lot of people don't. And now we have this opportunity to learn about her even more. And I think it's important for her to be relatable. And I wanted to write about her because she is so relatable to so many different types of people. In particular, when I think about the women that are part of the civil rights historiography, many of them, they're not from, or they don't foreground their working class roots. And it's important to me to have written this book in a way that describes how she ascends. She says that sometimes her family is literally eating the crumbs that are left over from the young men at Yale University. That's important because, Sherilyn, I truly believe that talent exists throughout this country, everywhere. It's opportunity that does not. And it matters for those who may read this book, who might learn Motley's story, who are similarly situated, to appreciate that they too can go on to achieve great things. And I can say so much more, you know, the West Indian.
Well, and she had the huge, so I'm the youngest of 10 children.
Yes.
And so, you know, when you come from a huge working class to poor family, you're always looking for analogs, you know, and you're kind of strange, you know, among your peers, because most people don't have families that are that huge. So when you find someone who's incredibly accomplished, who also comes from a large family, that is even part of it. Like all of these layers and she remains quite close with her family, you know, over time as well. But so much of that feels so familiar, and as you point out, allows different kinds of people to kind of touch her because you so explore those aspects of her. And you were beginning to talk about her being West Indian. Let's talk a little bit about the family that she comes from and that dynamic that exists among the family when they're in New Haven.
Yeah, happy to. It's an important part of the story, her West Indian background. Her parents immigrated to this country in the early 20th century from Nevis in the West Indies. They landed, part of them in New York, another part in New Haven. And there in New Haven, her father and virtually all of her male relatives worked for Yale University. So she grew up in the shadow of Yale. But it's not a situation where that difference between the class position of the men at Yale and the Baker's own class position bred resentment. To the contrary, her father seemed to write the privilege of the young men he interacted with into himself. And then he had come to this country with a sense of superiority. He was literally a part of what were called special people in Nevis, which meant he was relatively well educated. He worked in a trade, and they were also socially conservative. Motley writes about how strict her father is. And so there's a lot there that's shaping, including the component about intra-racial difference and conflict, which I think is important to bring out. And I conclude that either because of or in spite of her father's attitudes in particular about Southern Blacks, she became the civil rights queen. It's just an extraordinary reality, and one in particular that I enjoy meditating on. My family's from the Deep South, and it is absolutely the case that but for Constance Baker Motley, there's no way that I would have been able to achieve the things that I have. And it's remarkable to think that she went on to do what she did despite some of those teachings.
You know, given, yeah, when I go out and give talks, I'm very often tick off, Council Speaker Motley's accomplishments, because as you point out, so many people have not heard of her, who are not, kind of people who are kind of particularly in our profession. And so, when I speak at universities, if you think about the kind of accomplishments, in terms of just desegregating universities, with Clemson and Georgia and Ole Miss and Alabama and so many others. It's, as you point out, literally changing kind of the legal architecture of the country. And one of the great things about your book is that you begin to give some clues about the kind of person that Motley is from your description of how she forms herself.
Mm.
Now, something I also, knew Judge Motley and, and had many conversations with her, and including about her family and her upbringing. What I didn't know and what incredibly impressed me was how she took hold of her college education. She wanted to go south to Fisk, and she did go to Fisk. And she grew fairly quickly dissatisfied, you report, with Fisk, and made the decision to come back up north. She had been kind of an activist, high school student, and Fisk just wasn't doing it for her, at least at that time. And she came back up and ended up at NYU. And I actually found, for a woman at that time, a woman, as you pointed out, who could not have gone to college without assistance, a woman who, in your text, doesn't consider herself necessarily at the top of the class, certainly when she graduates from law school, but she has the wherewithal to know what is for her and what is not, right? Is what is the environment where she wants to learn and be shaped. And she ends up loving NYU, Columbia Law School, not so much, right? And I would love for you to talk about this, this activism that she'd like to be connected to, and the wherewithal she has, the self-possession as a young woman to decide first, I want to go south to Fisk, to go to Fisk and then say, no, this is not it, to come back up north, not to back to New Haven, but to New York to go to NYU. I found it extraordinary actually reading it, given the time period we're talking about and a young woman who's making these kinds of consequential decisions.
Right. I start the book off with a poem that Baker wrote when she was just 15 years old, which is just extraordinarily thoughtful for a 15-year-old. She was very much in touch and already had developed this yearning for change for herself and others. She was involved in any number of clubs, social groups when she was a teenager that were seeking change. And I should mention that in New Haven, in addition to teachers who helped to form her, she was aware of George Crawford, who was the Black man who had graduated from Yale Law Schools from Alabama, became the corporation counsel, and was collaborated with the NAACP. She became aware of him. He introduced her to some of those early cases. She wants to go to Fisk in part because she's intrigued by the South. She also is intrigued by HBCUs, and she goes there and she experiences a Black middle class, Black people who have one or two generations, even in their families, who have college degrees. And it's eye-opening for her, but she doesn't find the students as activist as she is, and she already has that in her. And so she does come back to NYU. She wants to be in New York. She wants to experience the Black Mecca in Harlem, and at NYU around there, she's around bohemians and people who were on the left and who are concerned about inequality, not only racial inequality, but about class disadvantage. And so she's really in her element, and she loves NYU. And I hope that NYU will embrace her even more now that her love for the institution is even clearer. Columbia Law School, of course, she's there before civil rights law is being
Yes.
made, and it's just not that alluring for her, although she has friends like Bella Abzug who helped to buck her up.
And it's quite sexist at that time. I don't recall what particular years we're talking about that she was at Columbia, but she talks about, you know, the process of calling on students and how women are treated by professors. This is not exclusive to Columbia, but would have been the scene in most major law schools at the time. And obviously that's, you know, something unsettling for her as well.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about something you alluded to when you read that first passage about James Meredith, which, you know, if you practice civil rights law, you know, I always say that the relationships with our clients are so powerful and so important, and what we feel we are doing for them is so powerful and so important. They're incredibly inspiring. And, you know, certainly in your writing, you have talked about, you know, circumstances when LDF lawyers lost sight of their clients. And these have been cautionary tales for us we take so seriously building that relationship and remaining in communication and being led by what our clients actually want out of the litigation to the extent that we can. But certainly as a civil rights litigator, if doing impact litigation, you are doing shaping and strategizing and thinking and so forth. And you're doing a little bit of what you alluded to, which is developing that relationship with your clients, in which sometimes you have to buck them up or inspire them or, you know, keep them going. And that's what you described with James Meredith. You also describe at length, you know, the inability to keep things going with Autherine Lucy, who's the plaintiff in the University of Alabama case. And so, you know, so there's that. And then the relationships, and I'm so glad you read that passage, because I've always been so moved in Judge Motley's own memoir of her account of her relationship with Medgar Evers. It is often true, you know, I can speak from experience in doing this work, that we become very, very close with the people who are activists on the ground, who are essentially our Sherpas into the civil rights, the Southern communities where we're doing this work. And we can develop these extraordinary relationships because we find, you know, so much commonality and so much courage, and how much that affects her. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, about Motley and her relationships with both clients, you know, James Meredith being one of them, but also her relationships with folks on the ground and with colleagues, and how she managed those.
Thanks for that question. You know, it has been a theme in my work. It's just the exploration of the complexities in the relationship between public interest lawyers and their clients. And they are complex. And in the book, I try to tell stories that illuminate various dimensions of the relationship. So with James Meredith, it is definitely keeping him going, you know, believing in him at moments when he no longer believes that he himself can take on the continued challenges, the personal losses that he has to endure. And I talk about Autherine Lucy and Pollyann Meyer. Some people may not know that the University of Alabama case, there were two phases of it. Sherilyn is referring to the clients in the first phase, which I discuss to illustrate the pain of being a pioneer as a client, right? All of these people were so courageous, and yet they could not know fully what they were getting themselves into, because one couldn't predict precisely the form that white backlash would take. And I discuss how in the Alabama case, the university uses against Pollyann Meyer the fact that she had had a pre-marital child, and she's dropped from the case, and it's a difficult moment. And yet, including because Motley and others of the civil rights lawyers believe in the politics of respectability and believe that the group, in some sense, and the interests of the group have to predominate. If there comes a moment when there's a client, as there was in this case, who is not going to be a good representative in the context of white backlash. As for her colleagues, I talk about how she and Robert Carter litigated this case in Jackson, Mississippi on behalf of Black school teachers. And one of the things that I bring out is how Motley, who's pretty reserved, and is able to, she wears a mask, which is self-protective, and in the context of all that she's facing, actually is quite perturbed when she and Bob Carter go and try to buy fruit at a fruit stand, and the proprietor is disrespectful to Bob Carter, who is served in the Army and who is just this amazing person. I know him personally. I clerked for him, and she feels herself, he feels her sort of tightening up, tensing up, and she wants to say something back. She wants to talk back to this white man who's disrespectful to her colleague and her friend. And she feels him sort of putting his arm on hers, as if to say, no, it's not worth it. It's not worth it at this moment. And that story just illustrates the incredible bonds that these lawyers form. There's nothing like, being in it with people when you're on a mission in the way that they were. And that's a terrific story that illustrates that. And then Medgar Evers, every time I read that passage, I just get a catch in my throat. Yeah. It's so hard. It was so, I tell stories in the book about how
she would stay with the family when she came down.
That's right. She stayed with the family, and she actually pointed out to Medgar that there were hedges close to the house where someone might hide out and try to do him harm. And that's precisely what happened. He was assassinated in that way. And so it's just, all of those stories reveal, as you were saying, something about Motley, the person, which I think is important to reveal. That her heart. Go ahead.
No, please, no, you please go ahead. I'm just thinking about Medgar Evers, just to stick with him for a moment in that relationship. She vows that, and she talks about this in her own memoir, that she'll never go back to Mississippi, and she doesn't until I think maybe the 1980s. What was the occasion for her going back to Mississippi? I don't recall.
Yeah, so there was some kind of event at the university, and I can't recall what it was, but it takes her 20 years to go back.
Yeah, I mean it's that powerful. That's so important. She's not just saying it like you say things when in the moment of grief. It really for her is so overwhelmingly painful to imagine that someone of Medgar's extraordinary talent, stature, generosity, warmth, and commitment, can be killed like that on his driveway in front of his wife and children. And she really feels this. I mean, to me, it's a pretty powerful story to think about someone who spent that much time in Mississippi, desegregating the flagship university in this, the case that Marshall thinks is the crazy case, the Ole Miss, the standard bearer, for the South, and she's the one, right, who does it. And but how the killing of Medgar Evers could just make her shut down the whole state. And I very much resonate with that. We have experiences as civil rights lawyers that move us emotionally, very, very powerfully, particularly because you develop relationships with people and things happen, to you in particular counties. The Bob Carter story is so important. I've been in that situation where I've been one of the two people, right? The person who wants to say something, or the person who's saying, let's just get out of here. Let's not worry about it. You need that wing person. And I just thought that was beautifully written and really important. And I think, for those of us who've been doing this work, felt powerful and resonant. and incredibly moving. But please, if you wanted to say more about,
Well,
her.
just one other thing, which is it's that Medgar Evers is assassinated and he's such a tremendous person. It's also that Motley knows it could have been her, right? It could have been her. It could have been her taken away from her child and her husband. It was just that close. I think that's a part of it as well.
Let's talk about Motley's family life, because this is something she and I talked about, because I was a young lawyer who was pregnant, and getting ready to have a baby, and was a litigator at LDF, and I really needed some advice on how to manage this. And so we had lunch and we talked about it at length. She was quite a devoted wife and mother. Tell us a little bit about how she met her husband, Joel Motley, and how she managed raising her son, Joel Jr., or the third, right, while being a litigator. And for those who just don't know, understand that LDF's headquarters was and is in New York. And so when you're litigating these cases, most of our cases, although not exclusively all, are in the South. I think her first oral argument was in upstate New York. We have cases in the North too, but mostly in the South. So when we talk about her in Alabama or in Georgia or in Mississippi, we're talking about her, flying down, spending, an incredible amount of time staying in people's homes and then having to come back home. And this was, this is a pretty unusual thing for a young mother at this point in the country. And she manages to pull this off. And she has this devoted partnership with her husband. So could you share something about that and her kind of relationship with her family?
Absolutely. They met in Harlem. She was staying at the WYCA and he was at the WMCA and, YMCA. And, they locked eyes. They had this whirlwind relationship. They liked each other. He was unlike her father, who was strict and conformed to all of the gender conventions of the time. And Joel Jr. was mild-mannered and he loved her. He was devoted to her. I note that she is pregnant, goes on maternity leave, and Joel III is an infant around the same time that the Inc. Fund is litigating Brown versus Board of Education. And just imagine that. The lawyers are working such long hours. They are away from their families for days at a time. And in addition to navigating all of that, she has this infant son. And so how does she do it? She has her husband who co-parents. She has her siblings who pitch in. She is vocal that if you can afford it, you need to hire help, which I appreciate.
She's unashamed. She's unashamed.
That's right. And it's also true that if she is away from her child for long stretches of time. She has to be. That's the nature of the work.
Mm-hmm.
And she tries to keep in touch with them. She would, in the UGA case, I talk about how she would go at the end of the day after her hearing and ask to use the phone in the judicial office and call back to New York just to hear their voices. And she also would fly back as often as she could to see them, when one can imagine she could have stayed and rested in the city where she was. So she was just going back and forth all the time to get the job done. And so it's a marriage that is egalitarian. Well,
he's a finance guy, right? He's not.
That's right. He's a real estate broker in Harlem. So he has he has his own firm, which introduces some flexibility.
Yeah.
So that he can do all of these things. And she says, by the way, I was making the point that the marriage was egalitarian before that was really a thing. And she certainly agrees. She also says that he always made more than her. And
Mhm.
so in that sense, there was gender convention, and she thought
Yes.
that was important to
Yeah.
his ability to endure being in her shadow. in a
I
real way.
loved that. I had never heard say that until I read it in your book.
Yeah,
Just very perceptive,
absolutely.
very, very perceptive of her to see that difference mattered.
And honest, right?
Yes, 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 yes.
Or-
So I want to talk about her transition out of LDF.
Mhm.
Can't do that without talking about the leadership transition at LDF. LDF
Mm,
undergone a leadership transition as I stepped down, and Janae Nelson is the new director counsel. And I was super conscious of transition years before, I made the decision to go, of how do you do this right in a
Yeah.
way that doesn't shatter the organization, in a way that allows your senior team to feel respected, and so on and so forth. And we were super, super intentional, and I think have been quite successful in how we have managed and rolled out both internally and externally our transition. Not so much with Thurgood Marshall deciding to leave. And of course, he leaves and he's appointed to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, later then Solicitor General, and then thereafter, he is appointed to the United States Supreme Court the year after Judge Motley is confirmed as a federal judge. So could you say a bit about that? I don't know how much time we have, but we've got to get this in. And then I want to talk a little bit about her being a politician before she becomes a judge. So I don't know when this is going to end, but let's keep going.
Sure. It is not a smooth transition. And I suppose one thing to highlight is, well, just to tell the story, both Motley and Bob Carter and some other Black lawyers think that they deserve to be considered. And instead, it's Jack Greenberg, who was this white Jewish lawyer who's been in the trenches for a long time, who is selected. Motley is hurt. Bob Carter is hurt. And yet I want to say a couple of things. One of the context is really important. The context for Marshall and his career, the context of white resistance is important to understanding the dynamics there. And as Motley herself realizes, it would have been extraordinarily progressive had she been selected
To say
as
the least.
leader of this organization, which is so important in the country, to African Americans. It just would have been extraordinary. And she says, women didn't have that kind of status at that time. In fact, it takes her going into the bench, right, to open up the doors to women to attain the kind of stature that eluded her at that time.
And I'll just point out, Dean Nagin, that one of the reasons I was having the conversation with her, the conversation I was having with her was in 1990, was because I think maybe there had only been one other woman litigator who had children and stayed on, right, as a litigator, continuing to litigate cases at LDF. That's how rare it was to have someone who was also a mom, be on the litigation team, engaging full-time in litigation at LDF. So that just gives you a sense. Of course, as I've said, I'm the second, this is an 82-year-old organization. I'm the second woman leader. The first was Elaine Jones who ascended in 1993. So you're just to put in context once more, how, that piece took a bit to catch up. We've always had fantastic women litigators, but doing it the way Judge Motley did it, she was truly a trailblazer internally. And as you point out in the book, even had to fight for her own salary to commensurate with others.
So, and I have to say, Sherilyn, as you probably can imagine, it was difficult for me to write about that. Thurgood Marshall is my hero. The book does note that he had blind spots. And it's to be expected, given the times. Nevertheless, that's difficult to write about, which brings me to my second point, which is that Constance Baker Motley always said she was always grateful to Thurgood Marshall for hiring
Mhm.
her in 1945 when she had had the doors closed to her by Manhattan law firms, right? So she was so grateful to him and always said that had there not been for Thurgood Marshall, no one ever would have heard of Constance Baker Motley.
Truth.
So he
Mhm.
made her career.
And the assignments that she was given. I mean,
Yes,
we
that's
talked
right.
about the Meredith case. He says, that's your case, right? He's not hovering over her. He's not micromanaging her. He's not, right? The authority that she has over her own litigation is pretty, once she's kind of up to speed, is pretty powerful and unusual for that period as well.
That's right. You have to get the right assignments in order to make your name.
Mhm.
And that's something that the Meredith case does for her. So on the transition to politics, after the Meredith case in particular, Motley has name recognition, which of
Mhm.
course is invaluable in politics. And so various people in the Democratic Party in New York come to her and they ask her to run for the Senate. She's skeptical, but she eventually does. And then she runs for Manhattan Borough President and prevails. And I do note that there are plenty of people who say she should stay in her lane.
Mhm.
She shouldn't be running for office, that as compared to, say, Adam Clayton Powell, she's not an authentic Black person, whatever they mean by that.
Mhm.
And of course, Black power is rising. She represents the struggle for integration, and some people are skeptical of her for that reason. Meanwhile, she's in politics for a couple of years where the scrutiny on her is just tremendous from all sides. And then she ends up getting the bid for to go into the court. Johnson initially wants to appoint her to the Second Circuit. That doesn't happen because of pushback. She goes into the federal district court, and she has a long career there, where she is able to decide some cases that are really important, including one involving women lawyers. NYU.
Yes, let's talk about that for a
Yeah,
second.
yeah.
This may have to be the last question, but
Sure.
I'm gonna add a lot into it. Because this brings us back to Judge, soon to be Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who references Judge Motley quite a bit. And of course, President Biden had announced his intention to appoint a Black woman. And of course, the question was, what does that mean? What role will race play? There were people who were saying, well, that's racist. How is race going to influence her decisions? We saw some of this with Justice Sotomayor's nomination as well. And I've written extensively about this and about that case that you're referring to, but I'd love for you to share it, because I think it's a quintessential case moment that brings together the full-on experience of Judge Motley becoming a woman lawyer, politician, and judge. That one decision. And if you could just share that so that people can understand the kind of trailblazing person that she is. That case is cited over and over again by Black judges, women judges, gay judges, to push back against efforts to say that they are biased as judges because of their race, gender, sexual orientation.
Absolutely. Great case. It's Blank versus Sullivan and Crummell. Diana Blank sued. She and other NYU graduates, women graduates, sued the law firm, saying that they were not hired as they should have been. They were not promoted if they were hired. It was an early Title VII case applying the principles of the anti-discrimination law in the context of professional employment, where certain credentials were needed in order to get oneself in the door. And so it was a path-breaking kind of case. Motley drew the case after a spin of the wheel. The law firm was not happy. And the attorney said to her, literally argued, wrote her a letter, then filed a recusal motion saying, because you are a Black woman, you cannot be fair in this case. You cannot handle this case. You probably have experienced workplace discrimination, and so you should recuse yourself. Essentially, as Motley pointed out in her brilliant decision denying the recusal motion, he was saying only a white male could decide a sex discrimination case. And she rejected this, saying that everybody has a background and experiences. White men have gender and a sex. And if the standard were having experiences and demographic characteristics, then no judge on the court could hear the case. An outstanding opinion that has been cited again and again for that principle. And it shows her intellectual power. It also shows that being the civil rights queen is a double-edged sword. She is just continually thought to be quote unquote biased. And we could spend a lot of time unpacking that. Really, in this context, it means that she's open to the claim, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, she's
Absolutely.
fair, right?
She's fair.
Yeah, and
She's
that's the
fair.
problem.
Well, and of course, even her nomination, you know, for those who don't know, and watched what Judge Jackson went through last week, there was a whole line of questioning that held up her nomination for a while that related to the relationships that she had as essentially a teenager, a 17, 18-year-old, with various kind of extremely left-leaning folks in New York to brand her as a communist. And this was, you know, what, 30, 40 years later, they were, or I guess 30 years later, they were using this as a way of trying to suggest that she, you know, to paint a picture of her, quite in the way we saw the effort to paint a picture, a false picture of Judge Jackson last week in the hearing. And it was a depressing similarity in the effort to tarnish Judge Jackson, but not without precedent and therefore important for us to kind of see. Now, I want to just take in one of these audience questions, which I had a chance to take a look at, and maybe I can put two together. One of the questions is, what is it you hope young lawyers and law students can take away from this book about Judge Motley in terms of thinking about their own careers and particularly, you know, careers in civil rights? And is there anything you left out of the book that you just couldn't get in, but I think is kind of interesting?
So the latter question is easier to answer, and that is, I thought of including in the book some case studies of some of her corporate cases, and I ended up not doing that. And why? And what was the concern? Well, so if a theme of the book is that her civil rights background always followed her, and you know, people thought that either she was going to be amazing in the civil rights cases or she was going to be awful in the civil rights cases, depending on their perspective. I thought, well, I want to have a wider range of cases represented. But I just, the book was already too long for the publisher. And it turns out that some of her greatest cases involved civil rights law in one way or the other, most illustrative cases. So I left out most of the corporate law stuff, although I mention it in the epilogue. As to what I want people to take away, in a word, Motley stands for what we're now referring to as Black excellence. She truly, truly did. And I think it's important to know that well before the Civil Rights Act was passed, you had this incredible woman who strove for excellence despite all that was stacked against her. And there were so many things. The other thing I want students to take away in particular is that Motley had the courage of her convictions. We don't have time, I gather, to talk about this, but one of the cases that she decided was a prisoner's rights case involving Martin Sostre, where she ruled for him in a case where he alleged that solitary confinement was a violation of his constitutional rights. Motley did not have to rule in favor of Martin Sostre, but she did because she thought it was the right thing to do. And I want to tell you, I don't think that ruling in his favor was good for her own promotion prospects. Right? But she did it because she had the courage of her convictions. She ruled without fear or favor. And I think that that courage is something that we all need to remind ourselves of, to just stand up for what we believe, although it's not always going to, one has to sometimes suffer the consequences of being principled. And that is the story of many civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr., Constance Baker Motley, and it's one we just need to continually remind ourselves of, I think.
I can't imagine a better note to end on. That was lovely. Thank you so much. So please get the book. It's deemed Tomiko Brown Nagin, Civil Rights Queen, about the great Constance Baker Motley. It is probably true that for most Black women lawyers of the generation of which Dean Brown Nagin is a part, and I am a part as well, have looked up to this extraordinary woman. She was the trailblazer. And so when you hear Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson reference her, she is referencing someone who has been a kind of lodestar for so many of us. The book is terrific. It's chock full of facts and information about what was happening in New York and what was happening in politics, and incredibly well researched. I'm so proud of you and so happy. We're so happy at LDF to finally have this full account of Judge Motley's life. So congratulations to you, Tomiko Brown Nagin. Please, folks, pick the book up, Civil Rights Queen. It is the story of Constance Baker Motley and the struggle for equality. Such an excellent book. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Sherilyn. I so appreciate your conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, for writing this wonderful book. To repeat it again, Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley and the Struggle for Equality. Please, all of our audience, we hope that you buy the book, read the book, and learn more about this extraordinary human. So thank you to Dean Brown Nagin for writing this book. Thank you to Sherilyn Ifill for bringing your wonderful experience to moderating this powerful conversation. Thank you to our co-sponsors, LACA and WALK, and thank you to our audience for joining us tonight. So from all of us here at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network, have a wonderful evening. We hope you'll join us at our future events. And again, please read this book and we'll see you soon. Thank you.